You didn't lose. You didn't lose. You won last. Well, if I won, why don't I get the trophy? Why don't I get the money? Why don't I get this? Because we've taught them to be bad sports. We've taught them to be unsportsmanlike. We've taught them to not accept loss, to not learn from failure, and to not build character. And so when they're in their 30s, they come back to live at home with mom, and they, rather than being part of the household, they become a liability, or you have to claim them on your tax return because they're part of the problem now. And that's the danger that's happened, part of the danger from the SAT situation. Now, in the Howard Beach section of Queens, New York, blacks were targeted by marauding whites and set upon, with one of them being murdered while being run over by a car from the group. So, Howard Beach in New York City, massive eruption of violence, marauding whites, Americans out having a good time, found some black guys, let's have some fun. One of them gets killed in the process, ran over by a car. You want to know what happened to those that did so? They weren't even prosecuted. Weren't even tried in court, didn't even see their day in court. Nothing. Sparked a riot. What's wrong with those black guys? What are they rioting for? Okay, so one of them died. It could have been worse, could have been several. It's rioting. The Challenger flight exploded not long after takeoff, killing all on board. This was seen live by millions throughout the world. The Challenger, right? The Challenger flight, which was supposed to be the height of the U.S.'s technology, was an embarrassment for the U.S. This is our greatest ship that we have. We have our first Jewish astronaut. We have all of these other astronauts that are here. They are going to dock with the new station we've got there, and they're going to show you the U.S.'s might. We're going to go into great detail about our Star Wars program. Exploded halfway up. Fuselage disconnected. The announcer can only say there seems to be a problem with the fuselage, as parts of it are going in 7 different directions. We're going to go to a commercial now. Come back from commercial, still sections of the fuselage flying all over the place. And that would ground NASA's activities for another 3 to 4 years. Alex Oda, Palestinian Bedouin activist, was murdered by members of the Jewish Defense League in 1406, and his crime still remains unsolved, although the logbooks of the JDL need only be opened and checked. You want to know who killed him? We can only open the logbooks. It's easy to find out. It's a $1 million reward. No one knows who killed him in the JDL, the Jewish Defense League. No one knows who killed him. The Jewish terrorist extremist organization in the United States tried to bomb the Central Masjid in Los Angeles as well in 2001. Nobody knows who did that. This is the situation. This is the situation. Chadian Bedouin forces destroyed encroaching Libyan forces in 1407. There was also the massive recession that came with a 700-point dip. They called it Black Monday. Huge dip in the Dow Jones. 700-point dip. 700-point dip. I remember being driven home by my parents and my mother expressly commanding me not to look out of the window as I heard the sound of banging on the pavement. And I disobeyed her at one point and could see men loosening their ties, jumping off of buildings, bouncing on the pavement before their bodies were lifeless. Seeing men jumping and hitting metal awning, and it looked like it was from the cartoons, how it would splatter and hit it and make that mark like you see in the cartoons of the man stuck inside of the metal. It was doing all of these things. All of this was happening because people lost everything in 1987. Crack addiction went through the roof because Reaganomics, Ronald Reagan's economic package, which was carted out when Ronald Reagan said, quote, "I looked in the paper just the other day and I saw plenty of jobs." This was part of Reaganomics. Reaganomics also brought him into an interview with the Native American tribes of the U.S. in which they were complaining about their bad treatment. Ronald Reagan said, well, if they don't like it here, they can go back where they came from. A Secret Service agent had to explain to them, Mr. President, they are from here. So Reaganomics was out of touch with the vast majority of people there, and people suffered for it. People suffered for it. So the Bedouin situation in the U.S., there began to be this competition between the Arabs that were Hadari and Bedawi. The desert Arabs that came to the U.S. first, and the Hadari Arabs that came after. And the Bedouin Arabs, there was a lot of activism in the 60s and the 70s from Iskandar Oda and other Bedouin activists. And there were solidarity marches between the Bedouin Arabs and Mexicans because they were seen that they had a lot in common. Both cultures are very traditional. Even some of the clothing looks similar. Our way of looking at the world, family-oriented, hardworking, industrious, all these other things, being refugees. You know, there was a lot of cross-pollination between the two cultures, the Brown Berets and the Cairo 7 and all these different groups. The Iran-Contra trials also began to try to establish responsibility for the crack war and the source of its revenues as a smokescreen while the Contra destabilization continued. So they're having these Iran-Contra trials on television when they're asking Ronald Reagan, where are the revenues from this crack coming from? And he's saying, I don't recall. Who signed the order for this? It's got your signature on it. I didn't sign that. Who did? I don't recall. In which the exasperated lawyer finally turned and said, after a series of hours of questioning, and said, Mr. President, what do you recall? Because he was so frustrated from asking him how many times, and he's saying, I don't recall. Meanwhile, hours and hours of conferences and trials are taking up 6 television stations in the U.S. on live airtime. And there's a whole war going on in Central America. The Contra war is still continuing, annihilating those people for natural resources like oil, diamonds, agate, and also their beef, because the U.S. started to run out of beef in the late 70s because of how many hamburgers they eat, how much beef they eat. So they had to go and start cattle rustling, stealing meat from other countries. And it's part of what led to the Contra situation in Central America, that it was all over hamburgers, but part of it was. Part of it was. The first intifada among the Palestinians also began in this year. There was another AIDS victim. And this AIDS victim was Liberace. Many began to call AIDS gay or homo cancer, as it seemed to only be striking homosexuals, the most high-risk sexually active group in the United States. The flamboyant Liberace, known for his buoyant concerts and his high-pitched voice when singing, and his different outfits, colorfully decorated, and his string of lovers from all sides of the fence, died a shrunken skeleton of his normal self. This solidified in many people's minds that AIDS, this is something that's just annihilating homosexuals. It's not our problem. Many people, it solidified that. This would be followed by the suicide of homosexual and black activist James Baldwin. Now, James Baldwin was the first case where people actually found out, wait a minute, hold on. Black people get AIDS? Because this had been seen that, no, if you're homosexual and you're white, this is going to get you. But he's black and he's got AIDS? What? James Baldwin killed himself. Street Knowledge Hip Hop was born in the year with the release of 6 in the Morning, one of the longest songs in hip hop history. It would be the first West Coast song to draw attention to the genocide of minority youth in the United States and the swelling prison populations. This was an attempt to politicize the situation of what was going on the West Coast. And it was the first time this was done on an album. And the artist that had recorded this was put under huge stress and strain because this had never been done before. And other artists released similar albums. Louis Farrakhan would reemerge with a Resurrected Nation of Islam group. He, like many in the organization, had been dissatisfied when in 1393, the successor of Elijah Muhammad, who died of pneumonia in the said year, Warithuddin Muhammad, said his father was not a messenger, Allah was not a man, and that the white man was not the devil. Some felt the changes had been too fast, and that the change from the NOI to the Muslims of America was too drastic. So in light of this, Louis Farrakhan, who for almost 9 years had claimed he was a Sunni Muslim, rekindled the idolatry of the previous NOI teachings. Silas Muhammad would follow next. To strengthen his rank, ranks, Warithuddin proclaimed himself the Messiah and the Mahdi in one of his lectures and denounced the madhabs and fiqh as Pakistani and Arab culture. Now, part of this, you can see that definitely it's their fault. They've got to study more. They knew what proper Islam was and they rejected it. But we also have to look at the fact that their rank and file, part of the fault for what happened with some of the rank and file of the blacks does come down to the Muslim populations that were in that country, transplanted from others. Because some of us did not do as much as we could have to try to reach out to these people. And we can see glimpses of this here, where when people want to become Muslim, but they don't feel welcome by the host community, they form their own cult. They form their own group. And this should be a warning to us that if we don't treat people well when they come in through the door of Islam, that people will make their own Islam. They'll make their own way of doing things. They'll come about with their own doctrine. And this is precisely what happened. Precisely what happened. Jeffrey 12X had left the NOI before this time and became Siraj Wahaj. He's a very famous speaker now. He had been sent in 1400 AH along with Abdullah al-Faisal, Abdullah Hakim Quick, Dawood Adib, Abu Muslima, Abu Sama, and others to study at Salafi institutions in the Imam course training in Arabiya. They would return to teach this in New York City's Brooklyn, New Jersey's Patterson City, and Masjid Ahlus Sunnah would later be built in East Orange, New Jersey. And these would be some of the people that helped establish what is known as the Salafi Dawah in the United States. It was already being established, but they wanted it established particularly among the blacks. Because at that point in time, most blacks were Sunnis. And this caused incredible devastation and caused a lot of families to be broken up. Imam Siraj in recent years has gone quite some way to go away from Salafiyah. He's moved far from Salafiyah because he's realized its impracticality and has even checked some of the ahadith that they quote as proof and found that they're weak in terms of the understanding that they have of those authentic ahadith. The Salafi Dawah's understanding is incorrect. And he's found that that's the case. The Salafi Dawah in the US reached its epitome in the late 90s and then fell off in a major way because they failed to properly capture the black youth. Failed to capture them. And so, in light of that failure, other things came in. The NOI, gangbanging culture continued, and there was the beginning of a nascent Sunni Islam. Before that was commandeered recently in the US, there was an attempt to establish the Islam of the Sunnis in the US, but that fell off after 4 or 5 years. 1408 was a momentous year when the gangs of Los Angeles had now fully migrated and opened other chapters in other states on the West Coast, including Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Colorado. The horrible situation was when the originally sleepy town of Tacoma, Washington, passed Compton, California in its gang murder rate and was featured on the crime program 48 Hours. It was unbelievable. Tacoma, Washington. The section in Tacoma, which is known as Hilltop, the fact that that place in that year passed Compton. Compton's murder rate is 700. It's more than what happens in this whole country, the United Kingdom. When Tacoma passed Compton, that scared a lot of people. And they realized that this gangbanging thing, it's just absorbed the entire West Coast. It's absorbed it. And people were now trying to think, well, Operation Hammer by Daryl Gates, that doesn't work. These other issues don't work. What's wrong with these guys? And they weren't making the link between the color war and a lot of the other things. And so the gangbanging continued. One solitary doctor this year claimed that there might be a link between homosexuality and genetic disposition.